In 2022, Morocco finally became the first African country to reach the semi-final, going a step further than Cameroon, Senegal, and Ghana had managed. That is the number of African flags that will be flying at the 2026 World Cup that will take place in North America. And this is the number of African countries who have qualified to participate in the tournament. It is a doubling of the tally of the number of African countries that participated in the last edition of the tournament. And so from the Atlas Mountains of Morocco to the vibrant streets of Abidjan and Kinshasa and the hills of Cape Verde, Africa will have its biggest representation ever at the FIFA World Cup. In many ways, this is more seats at the table and more chances to shine, right? Well, not exactly. There's a specific disturbing trend that has characterized Africa's participation in the World Cup. In all but 2 tournaments, Africa tends to have what I will call the sole survivor syndrome, which is effectively only one African country advancing into the knockout stages of the World Cup and carrying the hopes of the entire African continent. Now, first, it's important to look at certain key milestones in Africa's participation in the World Cup. Morocco became the first country to reach the knockout stages when they topped their group at the 1986 World Cup. In 1990, Cameroon went a step further when they advanced the quarterfinal stage of the World Cup, claiming famously the scalp of Maradona's Argentina in the process. In 2002, Senegal matched Cameroon's achievement when they also reached the quarterfinal stage of the World Cup. Ghana was within a whisker of making it to the semi-final, but could only match the achievement of Cameroon and Senegal when they reached the quarter-final stage of the 2010 World Cup, which was also the first World Cup to be staged on African soil. In 2022, Morocco finally became the first African country to reach the semi-final, going a step further than Cameroon, Senegal, and Ghana had managed. But be that as it may, the bottleneck of the single survivor continues to be a pattern that defines Africa's participation in the World Cup. Thus, having 10 countries, which is a doubling of representation at the 48-team World Cup, enhance Africa's chances necessarily of making more or putting more teams in the knockout stages. Let's examine the facts. Since the World Cup was expanded to 32 teams, Africa has, in successive tournaments, encountered what I'll call the sole survivor bottleneck, which means in all but a few tournaments, Africa has always had only one representative advancing out of the group into the knockout stages. In 2002, Senegal reached the quarterfinals, but in doing so, they were the only African country to advance beyond the group stages of that particular tournament. In 2006, Ghana reached the round of 16. In doing so, Ghana was the only African team that advanced beyond the group stage of that particular tournament. In 2010, when Africa hosted the rest of the world on African soil, and there were great hopes for Africa's participation and indeed Africa's ability to compete, Ghana reached the quarterfinals, which was a huge achievement, but Ghana was the only African country to advance beyond the group stage of that particular tournament. In the 2014 tournament, which is an exception to the pattern that I'm talking about, both Nigeria and Algeria advanced out of the group, but their progress was halted in the round of 16. In 2018, no African country made it beyond the group stage of that particular World Cup in Russia. And in 2022, Morocco and Senegal advanced out of the group stages of the World Cup. Senegal fell in the round of 16, with Morocco making that historic run to the semi-final stage of the 2022 World Cup. So statistically speaking, 70 to 80% of African countries who have participated in the World Cup have exited at the first round stage of the World Cup. Now, why is this so? How do we correct this anomaly? And in 2026, how can we qualify more African countries out of the group stage into the knockout stages of the World Cup? Why do multiple African countries struggle to qualify for the knockout stages at any particular given World Cup? Let's look at the historical figures. Tactical naivety and pragmatism may perhaps be one of the biggest reasons. Historically, African teams have been lauded for their flair. And for many years, people have looked forward to seeing some of the biggest African players who play in Europe at the World Cup. But our teams have often been tactically naive, being punished for their defensive lapses and their enthusiasm to play more expansive football and show their skills at the world stage rather than playing tactically disciplined games that ensure that they're able to scrape through the group stages and move on to the knockout stages of the competition. In many competitions, we've seen how the Europeans and even increasingly the South American countries have put up very tactically disciplined displays, which is built around defensive solidity, which enables them, even when they do not play well, to go beyond the group stage. For many coaches, the real World Cup tournament starts when the knockout stage kicks off. Perhaps another palpable factor is the seeding disadvantage, and we'll see that in this 2026 World Cup. Due to the lower FIFA rankings that African countries mostly have compared to UEFA or CONMEBOL powers, African teams are rarely in the pot one of any World Cup draw. This almost guarantees that every African country that is drawn into the World Cup is drawn into a group where they face much stronger teams and very often are drawn against the heavyweights of world football. Now, once this happens, it makes the path into the knockout stages even harder for African countries. Now, closely associated with this is a chronic inability of African countries when they go into the World Cup to pick up teams against teams that may be considered the weaker teams or similarly ranked with the African countries. In many World Cups, we have had African countries being able to beat some of the most highly rated countries in the World Cup, only to fall against countries in games that they should have been able to win. And so we've seen very big upsets like Cameroon beating Maradona's Argentina at the 1990 World Cup, Senegal defeating defending champions France at the 2002 World Cup, and several other shocks. But very often, when crunch time comes and it matters the most in a particular game, African countries will fall against countries that you'd have thought they should be able to beat. But perhaps the biggest factor in the chances of African countries of making it into the knockout stages at the World Cup has been internal instability and the tendency for African countries to press the self-destruct button. In so many championships and tournaments that have been played in the past, African countries have gone into tournament completely destabilized by rife between coaches and players, between players and the federation, and perhaps the biggest source of strife has been over bonuses and financial inducements. Perhaps it doesn't get any worse than Ghana's situation at the 2014 World Cup, had to have money physically delivered to them at the World Cup. There are stories around how players who were playing on the field were worried in their last group game about the safety of their monies at the hotel, and some even reportedly took the money onto their matchday venue. Until African countries are able to resolve some of these factors, it would look like a steep curve to have multiple African countries qualify out of the group stage at the 2026 World Cup, despite having a doubled number of representation and playing in a 48-team tournament. So, what will be the blueprint for smashing this glass ceiling? It probably will start with the Moroccan model. In 2022, it was distinct how Walid Regragui's team, the Moroccan team, played pragmatic football all the way to the semi-final stage. In the past, we've seen African players play with a lot of flair. This Moroccan team was more tactically disciplined than most and did not change their shape, famously scraping through knockout matches by a goal to nil on each occasion. Nobody remembers how Morocco played. For everybody, what they remember is the fact that Morocco made it all the way into the semi-final stage of the World Cup. So perhaps in 2026, what the coaches and the teams should be looking at is how pragmatic they can be and how they can vary their tactics based on the game they are playing and the opponent they are playing to ensure they have a fighting chance of making it into the knockout stages. And if they do make it into the knockout stages, making it into the latter stages of the tournament, ensuring that perhaps Africa has its most successful tournament to date. It's also important that African countries stop trying to be everybody's favorite team. Nobody is counting the flair and how many nutmegs a player will have on the pitch. Nobody is counting how often stylish players like Kudus can dribble players in the middle of the pack. Nobody is counting how many players we are capable of dribbling before trying to put the ball in the net. The greatest goal scored at the World Cup was scored by Maradona. Nobody wants African players to go out there and try to replicate what Maradona has done. The most important thing is to find the back of the net, because when the final whistle comes, it is the number of goals that will be counted and not the number of nutmegs or dribbles that will be counted for teams. It's also important that we overcome the chaos that has characterized the campaigns at the World Cup for most African countries. And as the 2026 World Cup beckons, it is our hope that none of the African countries will be embroiled in any shenanigans or any conflict over bonuses ahead of kickoff of the tournament. With 10 teams, the math has changed. And if Africa can get 4 or 5 teams into the round of 32, perhaps this lone survivor narrative that has plagued Africa's World Cup campaign over the last few years will change. And we could have an effect across the continent that ensures that we no longer wallow in this level of mediocrity, and that it's no longer a miracle when multiple African countries advance to the knockout stages of the World Cup and give themselves a chance of perhaps bettering the record of Morocco by going all the way to the final of the World Cup. The 2026 World Cup is a crossroad for Africa, not just in terms of the numbers that we have participating in this tournament. The continent has the stars, the continent has the teams, the continent has the consistency that teams like Morocco and Senegal have built over the years. We don't need 10 teams just to participate. It is time for Africa to consider itself contenders at the World Cup rather than just participants. We need our teams to understand that 1-0 is as good as any other scoreline at the World Cup, and that what matters is to be able to make it to the knockout stages of the World Cup. We need our teams to understand that 1-0 is better than a beautiful 3-2 loss where you play the best champagne football in the world. For too long, African countries have blamed others for our challenges, including bad refereeing and sometimes conspiracy theories. The glass ceiling we are trying to break in 2026 is not about CONMEBOL or South America's superiority or UEFA's superiority for that matter. It's our own inconsistencies that have robbed us in the past. And in 2026, it is time to pick up the pieces and make a difference in Africa's participation in the World Cup. My name is Samuel Bartels, and this is VAR. Subscribe to our content on Yo Charlie and like our content. I'll see you for the next episode.